The Endless Steppe by Esther Hautzig. Chapter 4. Gypsum, it turned out, was a grayish-white powder dug out of a desolate land by people in despair. It was mined to make plaster casts for wounded soldiers. The site of this mine was bleak, so bleak that it made the village of Robuffs attractive by comparison. Adjacent to the gouged earth, 12 mud huts stood in a straight line. They were flanked by a large wooden building and a small wooden building. No gingerbread here. And all around it was the unbroken treeless steppe of Siberia, scorched by a blazing sun without so much as a cloud to protect it. As far as the eye could see, there was no visible connection to the rest of the world. 4 truckloads of people, about 150, had been assigned to this mine. And now we were sent to the larger of the 2 wooden buildings. Once inside, it was obvious that this building was a school that had been stripped of everything but its blackboards and 4 huge portraits of Lenin, Stalin, Marx, and Engels. Those were the founders of the Communist Party, which was ruling Russia at the time. 6 rooms opened off a main corridor, and the 26 of us who had traveled on the same bus filed into one of them. Pavlaka invited us to make ourselves at home. Our host was the only one who laughed raucously, which is like, ha 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 ha, at his gallows humor. The room was completely bare of furniture, no chairs, no tables, and most certainly no beds. Children persist in asking questions. Where are we going to sleep, Tata? On the floor? Even father lost his patience. No, Esther, he said sharply. We will all sleep on the ceiling like flies. It's already occupied by them, so there won't be any room for us, I retorted crossly. Indeed, the place was swarming with flies. Go, Esther. Go get a drink of water. Go to the bathroom. Go. Tata, as usual, was an incurable optimist. I found Pavlaka in the corridor. Excuse me, Mr. Pavlaka. Comrade, Pavlaka, he shrieked. Comrade. Always comrade. From now on. Do you understand? Yes, comrade, I said meekly. Please, comrade Pavlaka. Where can I get a drink of water? Comrade. And where is the bathroom? Please, comrade. Not so many comrades, he shrieked even louder. 1 or 2 is enough, and the bathroom is an outhouse. Which, he implied, throwing back his shoulders, was another triumph over capitalism. I did not know what an outhouse was, but I was afraid to ask the comrade. In due course, I found out. We were one of the 4 lucky groups. Father had found us living quarters in a corner of the room. In an utterly bare room, 2 walls to lean against, a corner to curl up into, were luxury. Mrs. Marshak and Boris were across the room from us, and it was a comfort to see their familiar faces. However, the strangers around us were not quite so strange as the ones in the cattle car, except for 1 or 2 peasants. For the most part, these were faces from my past, the shopkeepers, the middle-class professionals of Vilna. The only genuine capitalist, from a Soviet point of view, was my father, who, along with his family, had owned a very large business. It seemed to please everyone that father, who had helped them with their baggage, was a well-known citizen of Vilna. Once again, there was no one my own age here. Settled on the floor, we all used our belongings as backrests, seats, and pillows. And we waited. Even I, a child, had begun to feel oppressed. One had not the freedom to fetch so much as a glass of water by oneself. One waited to have water doled out. One waited. The flies buzzing around in the heat were free. I hated them, not for being flies, but for being free. Finally, the door opened. A boy appeared carrying a pail of water and 1 tin cup. He had a sunburned face, and he was smiling. He was friendly. I could have hugged him. Anyone want a drink? He asked. The boy was nearly mobbed. He dipped the cup into the pail and held it out. Dozens of hands reached for it. Wait a minute, he said, looking around. A boy with water also had authority. When he came toward us, he handed the cup to grandmother, who took a sip. Refreshed by the water, but even more so by the boy's deference, Grandmother lifted her head and became the matriarch, for the moment at least. See that everyone has water, she said. The boy took it for granted that an old woman could issue orders. He nodded his head. Encouraged, Mother put in her 2 cents, for the first time in weeks. Let the old people have first turn, then the children, and what is left we will drink. This became the procedure, with Grandmother deciding who was old and who was not. Waiting my turn, my thirst became so great that I nearly challenged Grandmother. She was picking some awfully young old people, it seemed to me. Would there be one drop of water left for me? No one, including of all the people, my antiseptic mother, appeared to mind drinking out of one cup. When my turn came, I took such a big sip that I was forced to blow out my cheeks to hold the water until I could swallow it in tiny, tiny gulps to make it last. Now it was camels that I envied. Well, it's kind of like Salva. You know, when they found water, they were very careful with it. And he had that gourd with water as they walked across the desert that he had to be very careful how he drank out of it. The pail of water was finished, and I was impressed with us as a group. There had been no fights. No one had pulled a knife. No one had done any of the things I had seen thirsty people do in the movies. Pavraka came in and once again told us not to move, that we would be called to a meeting. Pavraka's concern that he would lose one of his prisoners bordered on the insane. We did not move. We waited. The old people dozed. Some people stretched out and rested their heads on their clasped hands and stared into space. I put my head in my father's lap, and he twisted one of my braids around my nose. Mother, who normally would have objected that the dirty hair would make me sneeze, this time only looked sad. Had I changed as much as Mama, Tata, and Grandmother had? They looked so old, so bedraggled, so dirty. I held up my hand. It was black with grime. My hair smelled horrid around my nose, and I pushed it away. Pavraka came back and ordered us to march out and line up in front of the schoolhouse. We did so, and again we waited. Were we now to be sent to the mine? Would we never again see the sun, which was hotter than before and boiling us alive? Presently a man came out of the smaller building and stood in front of us. Pavraka introduced him as Comrade Alexander Ivanovich Makrinin, director of the gypsum mine. Comrade Makrinin stood in front of us for what seemed like ages, scanning the rows and rows of faces before him. Then he looked down at the ground. My heart was beating fast, and I imagined I could hear all the others' hearts beating too. "Welcome. Welcome to the mine," he said at last. The crowd stirred. Was this more of Pavraka's brand of malicious humor? But no, Makrinin had spoken gently, kindly. He meant to ease our pain. He kept on speaking gently in Russian. Even I, who knew little Russian, could tell it was a little more cultivated than Pavraka's, and it sounded like music after the harsh, demeaning bark of the soldiers and of Pavraka. For the first time in weeks, someone was addressing us as if we were human beings. Not one person among the 150 who stood there wished to be welcomed to this mine, but a gentle voice in a jailer made us feel less imprisoned. Makrinin, a stocky man with a round, flat face, continued to speak gently and kindly, without anger or meanness, rather with regret that we were all in this dreadful business together. He told us to arrange ourselves in family groups. He would then come to us and assign us to our tasks, which would start in the morning. He assured us that if we needed assistance, we were to go directly to his office in this small building. Also, it was there that we would be given our rations of bread. He hesitated before adding the words, "and other provisions." Tonight there would be pails of soup in each room. Tomorrow there would be bread. When he came to our family, Makrinin greeted my father with a courteous "Zdravствуйте," hello, in Russian. "I understand you are an electrical engineer by profession. Here we have nothing like that for you to do. However, we are in need of someone to drive a horse and cart." My father shrugged. "I have ridden horses, but I have never driven one nor harnessed one. I will do my best." Yes, that is a good idea. He turned to my mother. You will work with a group of women, and you will be in charge of them. What kind of work? Dynamiting the mines. Dynamiting? Mother's overheated face went white. Father broke in. Oh, please, why can't I do this? My wife could drive the buggy. That she could do, I am sure. Macrinnon flushed. The orders are for the men to drive the carts and work in the mine. The women will dynamite, the children will work in the fields, and the old people will shovel the gypsum. He was embarrassed. Those are my orders, he said softly. Now you may return to the school and rest if you wish. He turned away from us and went to the next group as quickly as he could. We walked back to the room silently, huddled together in our corner. Father finally exploded. Insanity! Insanity! Peasants are capitalists. Engineers drive horses. Women dynamite. What next? What next? Samuel, for God's sake, don't talk so loud. Someone will hear you. Here, the walls have ears. Remember that. That is an interesting figurative language. It means someone's always listening to you. She had been whispering, of course, but now she whispered directly into my ear. Remember that, Esther. Then, it isn't as bad as it could have been. At least we aren't in a concentration camp. What did you say? Grandmother asked. What did you say about a concentration camp? I said we should be thankful we are not in one. Is Solomon in one? Are you keeping something from me? My father scowled at Mother. No, no, he put his arm around his mother. Father is most certainly in another place like this, most certainly. Some blessing, Grandmother said sarcastically. But if that is so, why aren't we all here together? Why? Why? Because it is as I just said. Everything is insane, senseless. Mother pointed frantically to the walls, and he dropped his voice until it was barely audible. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Grandmother stretched out on the wooden floor and shielded her eyes with her arm. I saw her lips working. Solomon, Solomon. In our family, as in most European families of my childhood, old people were treated with special reverence. Now to see old men and old women sprawled on the bare floor without a tiny shred of comfort for their old bones seemed particularly to a child like a shocking breach of etiquette. That night the room was almost as hot as a cattle car. There was no light, and in the darkness it seemed even more crowded, perhaps because of the vastness outside. Flies buzzed incessantly, and to make matters worse, they had been joined by midges. I'm not sure what those are. 26 people tried to sleep, and their bodies turning and twisting on the floor made the boards creak and groan. Occasionally, someone who had fallen asleep would cry out in a nightmare, and each time this happened, Boris howled with fright. His fear was a boon to me, making me feel quite grown up by comparison and less afraid. At last the moon came up. I was afraid to go to a window to see it, but a moonbeam lit up some of the prone bodies. In this world, one did the best one could with what one had. I reverted to the time when I was younger, and I spoke to the shaft of moonlight. I thanked God for making me a little girl who would not have to use dynamite in a mine or shovel gypsum. I thanked God for allowing me to work in a field. I thought it was very saintly of me to be so thankful in this terrible place, and I fell asleep. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard a knock on the window near us. Father heard it too, and sat up, remaining motionless. There was another knock, and then, appearing at the window and disappearing almost all at once, was the face of a young girl. Father tiptoed to the window and leaned out. 2 young girls from the village had stolen a watermelon and cut it up to give to the Polish slave laborers. It's the first time that she's identified themselves as slave laborers, because that's what they were. They handed the slices up to Father, and silently, these were passed from person to person. The girls fled before Father could thank them properly. Those of us who were lucky enough to have a slice of that watermelon that night, like me, must count it as the most delectable food ever eaten any place by anyone. Perhaps, it will not be so terrible here after all, Father whispered before he went back to sleep. The truth is that he was both right and wrong. Very wrong. The next morning the whistle blew. At 6 o'clock that morning it was like a whip that lashed everyone to his feet. Since no one had undressed that first night, toilets consisted of straightening a skirt, pulling a trouser belt, smoothing a dirty head of hair. Later, those who had brought sheets or comforters would use them as dressing rooms. Squirming beneath them, those less fortunate would use coats or the outhouse. Pavraka stamped into the room. In the early morning light, he looked more hateful than ever, as if he had been brewing venom in his sleep. Women dynamiters, right. Men miners, left. Men truckers, forward. Children and old women, back of me. In my view, we were all children, every last one of us. Whoever ordered grown-ups around this way? Old grown-ups, civilian grown-ups. We did as we were told. There were no rebels among us. Not then, not later. Outside, the steppe was vast and silent. Not even a bird was overhead that morning, and he became Pavraka's accomplice in reducing us to insects. When the whistle blows, again, Pavraka informed him, some hours from now, go to the director's office. You will get bread there. I watched Mother go off to dynamite, Father to drive a cart, and Grandmother to shovel. There was not so much as a second to say goodbye. Until now we had been together day and night for 6 weeks, been inseparable. Now suddenly I was alone and desolate. I had been reared in the midst of a clan. I had Miss Rachel as my constant companion. Under the best of circumstances, I was not a child who made friends easily, and I felt dismembered. Left behind, standing forlornly, we were about a dozen children. Once again, none of them my age, each one more bedraggled and dirtier than the rest. One little girl, still somewhat plump after 6 weeks of near starvation, began to howl. An older girl, obviously her sister, tried to comfort her without success. Just then the boy, who had smiled when he brought our water, joined us. He looked over his shoulder before going up to the little girl. Pulling his lower lids down and poking his nose up, he made a pig face for her. He also grunted. It worked. She smiled through her tears, and we all felt better. He led us to the potato patch, and on the way he shed the role of happy-go-lucky, smiling young boy, and became a serious and stern young man as he lectured us. We were to do our work well. No, that would not be good enough. We were to do our work to perfection. If we did not weed properly, there would be no potatoes next winter. If there were no potatoes, we would all starve. Did any among us enjoy starving? He inquired severely. No, we cried from the bottoms of our empty bellies. I knew that I would do well, thanks to Grandfather Solomon. He had taught all of us children to be good gardeners. You must get your hands into the earth, he would tell us, and even covered up with soil up to his elbows, he himself still managed to look immaculate in his gardening clothes, his elegant little beard snow-white in the sunlight. The squeamish among us soon learned to keep our distaste for worms to ourselves. While Grandfather did not absolutely insist that we love worms, he made it quite clear that he would not tolerate anything less than coexistence. But weeds he would not tolerate. So, my grandchildren, what is it to be? A tangle or a garden? A tangle, a beautiful tangle, my cousin Salik would answer as he leaned against a tree, feigning exhaustion. Salik was my grandfather's favorite, a marvelously merry and wild boy whom we all adored. Salik, I almost called his name aloud, the way grandmother called to grandfather. For a second I had a fantasy that standing there close to the top of the world, with nothing to stop the sound, I would call out to my cousins one by one, and to Miss Rachel, and that wherever they were, they would hear me.